Hello, Cornerstone. I hope all of you are doing well. This is another one of these videos that we're trying to put out just to help you to think through various aspects of life. And so we're excited to be with you tonight. We're going to talk about a subject that I really love, and hopefully it'll be a subject that you can also grab a hold of, which is history. Now, I know that right away, probably most of you are thinking, oh my goodness, if they're going to do something on history, I don't want to do it. But I think you're going to be surprised how cool this is. Because as you all have wrestled through different things, whether we did a video kind of series on racism, we've done different looks at different aspects of life. And I think no matter what you do, history is always something that comes to play on how we think through things. And so we're going to do that. Specifically, we're going to wrestle through not only history, but how to come at it from a biblical worldview as we think through how things apply and how they come in integrated themselves into our lives. So tonight, though, we have, I'll just start over here on my left first, is Spencer McCush. He's here. He's my faithful partner in crime as we've tried to carry out all these different things. But tonight, a special way. Most of you don't know Jen Torres, maybe. You've heard her read scripture, which is always awesome. But she is involved with almost every video I think that we've done. Yep. She sits back in her little cave in the back and makes sure all the cameras are positioned and we get the right shots. And so we are so excited to have her tonight. She is someone that is definitely not only special to Cornerstone, but to me personally. I feel like whenever we're going to talk history, we can geek out. And I just love hearing her just as she talks through different things. So that's what we're going to do. We'll kind of get going a little bit, and I hope this really does encourage you. So Jen, everybody knows Spencer and I, whether they like it or not. But maybe just tell us a little bit about who you are, a little bit, so people can kind of get an understanding of who you are as we talk about this.
Sure. So I'm actually a museum registrar. So I'm in charge of all the artifacts at a museum. So usually I'm locked in the basement. You don't see me, but if you see me, I'm the one wearing the white gloves. So I'm in charge of all the artifacts at a museum. I do research and writing for exhibits. So what you see on the wall, sometimes I'm the one that's written it. I was always the nerdy kid that liked ancient Egypt and Greek mythology and read them for fun. So I ended up getting a degree in archaeology. Then I decided that I didn't really like camping, and so rather than going out on digs, I switched to museums, and people bring me things, and it works out much better. I have thought about getting a graduate degree in Egyptology, but then I found out you had to learn 9 languages, and that was not going to happen. So I got the master's in museum studies, and then I worked in several different museums, and then I ended up going back to grad school and got a PhD in history in 2013. So my focus there was Revolutionary War, early America, colonial America, and then specialties in public history and history and memory.
Wow. Okay, you and I officially...
She's smart. That's right. What I know.
And so, well, we'll be able to take everything she says maybe and relate it into the world in which they live in. Maybe just real quick also before we get going, so what does that mean, the whole memory history thing? Like, what do you kind of mean by that? Like, what does that mean?
So history and memory is a specialty that deals with not what happened necessarily in history, but what people remembered, but how that changes. And they took the work of sociologists and psychologists and they applied it to history. So there's different kinds of memory. There's your individual memory, but then there's also personal memory, but there's societal memory, there's collective memory. And all of that kind of changes, and all of our individual memories together help shape collective memory. When things pass out of living memory, they might still exist, but they change. But then there's this whole cycle of where things then become part of your memory because an event happens, an anniversary happens, or, why do people go to Gettysburg? Why do people go to Israel when they know what happened there? Because they want to be there. They want to be part of that story. They want to experience it for themselves. And then as it becomes part of their personal memory, then it gets recycled back into collective societal memory. And there's this whole process of what is remembered and forgotten and reshaped, and history is just constantly being cycled that way.
So is it fair to say, history is more than just, at least in the history of memory kind of stuff, it's more than just facts, it's how we remember those facts?
Yes. And that's very important because the past is the past and it's happened and it's over and done with. But what we know about it, even as academic historians, can change. We're always kind of one document away from everything that we knew being different.
Totally.
Yeah.
But yes, so memory is kind of the public memory, and it's what the general people know. And that's different than sort of academic history, which is what's written in books that maybe 10 people read. So it's what sort of everybody knows about a subject. But even then, different groups have different social memories all going on at the same time. And so what's important to one group might be different than what's important to a different group. What one group remembers might be different than another group. And it's not necessarily even sometimes that I don't want to remember that. Sometimes that's not part of their story. They're not connected to it. And so they don't have interest in it. They don't know about it. They're not connected to that piece. And so there's all these sort of waves happening concurrently.
Wow.
I just think, even as you were just describing that, I think there's huge implications for like events that are happening today,
Yes.
right now, and
Big time.
how we remember things. We remember things that are maybe more relevant to our story or more relevant to our past that we have some connection with. And if it's not part of our story, then we don't even. It's foreign to us, right? And
Right.
So, yeah, I think that's fascinating. So I'm excited to learn more.
And so if you have no connection to a particular piece of history, either because you don't know about it or you don't feel it's relevant to you, then you just don't feel connected to it. And it's not important to you, but sometimes then you just don't understand why it's important to somebody else. You don't feel connected to it. And if you don't feel connected to history or to a certain event, then sometimes you can just kind of feel lost and adrift, and you don't know how we got where we did. And sometimes if people have one set of memories about a certain event or subject and another people have a different set, then this group can't understand why this is so important to this group. And this group can't understand why this is so offensive to this group. Yeah. And once again, you've got all these, it's the spaghetti, just, all these interlying memories and intertwining beliefs going on at the same time.
So you must be fascinated, somebody who studied this, like watching how we're looking at race right now, is that to one group, right, one means one thing, to another group it means something else, and watching this thing just collide, like it must be fascinating for you to watch this right now.
Yes, so it was actually President Clinton who said, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you look back at the 1950s and think on the whole it was better than worse, then you're probably on one side of the aisle. If you look at the 60s and think it was better than worse, you're probably on another side of the aisle. And people are always looking at this particular section of history when they do that. They're not looking at all of this, or they're looking at this section and they're not looking at all of this. And so what's important to somebody, what connects to somebody is what they focus on. So when somebody says, I wish I could go back to the 1950s, they're probably talking about this portion of the 1950s. That doesn't necessarily mean they want to bring back all the bad things that happened. And then you've got people where they're not speaking the same language, because if I've got a different interpretation of an event, if I've got a different memory of an event, then even just saying, I wish we could go back to the 50s means something completely different to somebody else.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated whenever people say they want to go back to the early church, right? Well, and generally what they mean is, I like a certain segment that I read in the book of Acts, which is what I want to go back to. Now, when you expand what that means, they're like, well, no, not that. I want this, yeah.
So when people look at the past, they tend to almost have sort of two different interpretations. They either have the rose-colored glasses and the nostalgia, and they're only focusing on the good, and they're kind of forgetting the bad, whether they choose to forget it or whether it's been forgotten up till that point, and they just don't know that the bad was there. Or else you have a phenomenon, what's known as chronological snobbery, and that's we're better than everybody else. We know more than everybody else. That's when you hear people use the phrase, come on, it's 2020. Well, they said that in 2000, and they said that in 1980, and they said that in 1900, and they probably said it in the 14th century. So then there's that idea that just everything before us was bad and everything before last Tuesday is wrong and just we're so much better.
Yeah. So we as humans, and we talk about this a lot, we're hardwired to think in story, right? I just think you study just anthropologically how humans have been. We define all of life by a story. In fact, sometimes I can't explain something to you unless I tell a story to go along with it to help you understand it. So help me then understand, if that's all of us, right? We all think in story, and all of us in different ways are reaching back into history and grabbing different stories, right, and pulling it in. How does that affect then how I interpret the present?
Well, one thing that I think is interesting is that whenever somebody tells me, history is so boring, I don't like history. And it's like, how can you not like history? History is just stories. It's every story. It's everything that's ever happened down to every person's individual story. And The problem is that a lot of times in schools, what you learn about history is just this mind-numbingly boring list of dates and places and names that you have to memorize and write on a test. And it's like if you never went to a football game, all you knew about a game is, how many yards each team scored in each quarter. Or if, you knew nothing about the Dodger game other than just, what the ERA of the pitchers were, then it wouldn't be interesting or exciting. What's more interesting to you, knowing how many troops landed on, Normandy on D-Day, or watching that scene in Saving Private Ryan? Totally. Because a story is a way to transmit information that engages both your brain and your imagination. And it connects you to something in a way that just facts never will. And so you need to think about history as stories, and you need to find the stories in history because that will connect you to what happened in the past so much more than just, whatever you learned in a textbook.
Yeah, I guess the question I would have there is, you acknowledge the person at the front end who said, oh, I hate history, or and not to discount their experience with history. Maybe they've had a really bad experience with it. And so how can we, cultivate a love or an appreciation for it? Because my guess is, people who are watching going, well, I've never actually heard those stories. And so the bad experience with history, what you're saying, it's like, oh yeah, I want some of that. That sounds fun. Who does that? Where can I get that? Because
I would say just start with something that you're interested in. Are you interested in cars? Read about Henry Ford. If you're interested in the Tesla car, read about Nikola Tesla and see, why it's named after him. Just pick something that you're interested in. And I know teachers always say, oh, don't go to Wikipedia, it's a terrible source. Well, at this point, enough people have edited it that it's actually not that bad, unless it's kind of a hot button issue and then there's multiple people changing it every day.
From the day you access it.
Yes.
Yeah, we just open a whole other can of worms, a whole other discussion.
But it's a good starting point, at least, especially if you've got a good article that's going to have some references and some books. But if you don't want to read a book, then at this point, there's podcasts, there's YouTube videos, try not to get your history from memes and from TV, but maybe that sparks something for you. Maybe you watch a movie that's in a certain time period and you're like, I don't really know if that happened. Look that up, whether it's, like I said, a YouTube video or find a book. And then maybe once you get into the history of a subject and you want to know more than just what's written in a book, you can go back to the original sources. You can go back to old newspapers. They're all scanned and online nowadays. That's how I did most of my research, was from old newspapers, the genealogy bank and the newspaper archive. Books that are kind of out of print and before a certain date have been scanned and put on the internet. I've downloaded a whole bunch of books from the 18th and the 19th century. Read some of those. If you really want to get crazy, you can look at primary documents. So many things have been scanned nowadays. If you want to go to the National Archives, the Library of Congress, and you want to look at some of those original documents, then just kind of go down a rabbit hole, find something that interested you. And I would also definitely say go to a museum. That's probably my number one tip, is go to a museum.
And they can find you there.
Nope, I'm heading in the basement.
Oh yeah, you're in the back. You got the gloves on. So this is really a lot of why I'm excited to talk to you. As I peruse through people's social media, there is this phenomenal capacity that everybody has to grab history and then to bring it into our time and to generally use it for kind of their own means to explain how they're evaluating life. So maybe on one level, what's the problem with that? And then maybe on another level, so how are we supposed to use history to think through our time?
So, I'm not going to discourage somebody from seeing an article and going, oh, that's interesting, what's that about? Yeah. But you kind of have to have some things in the back of your mind, and not like a 12-point rubric you would have in a college class. But when you read an article, is that literally the only thing you know about that subject, or do you know anything else? Do you need to know more about that? Yeah. You need to evaluate that source. Is that person an expert? Do they back themselves up with facts and figures? Do they have references? Or do they just say, they say, or everybody knows? Check the date on the article. Some people have been, reposting stuff from 10 years ago. But also look at the tone of the article. Is the person who's writing it, do they have a very definite opinion? Or is it a little bit more factual. Everybody's going to have a bias, it's true, but is there an agenda being pushed forth in this article or whatever you're reading? And how do they treat people who don't feel the way that they feel? Anytime you see so-and-so destroys so-and-so, it's probably a good to stay away from. And then once again, is there room for doubt? Is there room for the other side? Or like I said, a document could show up tomorrow that changes everything we know about something. Are they humble? Are they saying, this is my opinion, this is what I know to the best of my knowledge at this point based on the sources? Or is it, this is right and everybody else is wrong and the end?
Yeah.
So at that point, I guess I'm just thinking, what you just described sounds like a whole lot of work.
Like I said, you don't have to do the 12-point rubric. It's just questions.
And I don't disagree with you, but I go, oh man, I don't have the time to fact check everything and to go back and validate sources. And isn't it okay for me just to go, man, you know what? I really like Jen or I really like Todd, and I'll just trust what they say.
Sure, you can always do that because you're vetting the source by knowing who posted it.
Okay, no, that's fine. But you would say it's okay to trust some sort. But how do you know who to trust then?
That would be going back and reading all the footnotes. No,
Yeah.
no, like I said, a lot of it you can kind of tell, like I said, just by the tone of the article. Is it the I'm right and everybody else is wrong and anybody who says something different is a bad person? Or is it, I've done some research and this is what I think?
So you would say the capacity and ability of the author to have nuanced thought, in other words, be able to see multiple sides of this particular issue, not just this one kind of vein that I'm going to look at this big particular topic. Yeah, because I feel like in today's world, as I've looked on specifically like social media, different things, there's this phenomenal capacity to reinterpret Nazis, Hitler, and so in other words, while Trump is in power, he is Hitler and Republicans are Nazis. When I remember when Obama was in power, or was our president, you suddenly Obama was Hitler and the Democrats were the Nazis. And there's this weird way in which we find these almost mythical figures of heinousness, right? And we then equate it to that particular moment. But yet it doesn't give a full-orbed picture of what's going on in that particular reality. It's just kind of a way to almost shut down an argument versus to invite people into something.
So whenever I see people say somebody is a Nazi or somebody's a fascist, I just keep picturing the Princess Bride. It was like, I don't think that word means what you think it means. And a lot of times they'll say, if you actually know about the time period and what, the political philosophy of the Third Reich was, you'll know that something that they say was done as like a Nazi is like diametrically opposed to their philosophy. So, but no, it has become a cultural shorthand for bad person.
Yeah.
And it is a way just to shut down an argument. It's just, I'm calling you a name, and since you're a bad person, everything you say is bad, and we can't trust anything that you say.
So from that vantage point then, you've kind of talked about this idea of how we might look rightly at history, right? Like, man, go back and enjoy it. Find these, these stories of people and engross yourself in it. So if I'm looking at something, maybe then, how do I know if what something there is true or not? Like, if I'm looking at something online, right? And so the other day, a guy calls me up and he says, hey, explain to me this Irish slavery thing, because I'm starting to see these things popping up. And he said to me, where do I start? So I gave him an answer, but like from your perspective, like as people are looking on this, kind of trying to understand history, because again, people, especially in and around the racism issue, there's just tons of historical data right now flooding to the surface, and you don't kind of know what to do with it. From your perspective, like what would you tell just the average person, hey, here's a good place to start. Here's how you might evaluate the veracity of what's going on or what's being said.
So I would say Google is your friend. And so just start Googling it and then see what comes up. And I would try to stick with articles, if you can, that are actually from a historical source rather than a newspaper, because they tend to be a little bit more biased at this point. If you see something and it's from the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress or National Geographic, it's probably going to be a slightly less biased article. Like I said, you can even start with Wikipedia. They tend to be, and like I said, unless it's a certain type of issue, they tend to be pretty good, just as a starting point. And then you can go, oh, okay. And then maybe go, well, what about this particular piece of it? Let me Google that and see if I can find an article about that particular piece.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to a for instance now, because I'm really excited to get towards, because you and I have talked so much about your dissertation, and we're gonna, just so everybody knows, we're gonna pick on George Washington a little bit, not because, we so appreciate him, and we're gonna pick on even an event in history, Valley Forge, which I'll let you maybe explain a little bit about what Valley Forge was in what's going on. But so maybe unpack for us like a little bit of what your dissertation was about, so that we can kind of now use your dissertation as a way to kind of maybe even talk about these events a little bit more. So I'm going to turn you loose. What was your dissertation kind of about?
So my dissertation was about Valley Forge. And if you don't know what Valley Forge is, it was a site in Pennsylvania just outside of Philadelphia. And it was the site of the winter encampments for the for the Continental Army during the Revolution. They were there from December of 1777 through June of 1778, because unlike now in the Revolution, they weren't fighting all the time. So armies would basically hang it up for the winter for the most part. They would go into quarters. The British were in Philadelphia that year, and the Continental Army was in Valley Forge, and they spent time and they built these log cabins for the soldiers. And nowadays it's a national park. There's monuments everywhere. They've reconstructed some of the huts. But so I looked at Valley Forge as a case study, and rather than saying what happened at Valley Forge, because sometimes you would see books and they'd be like, there's so much myth around Valley Forge, I'm gonna tell you what really happened. Well, I didn't care what happened. I care what happens, but my dissertation was about the memory and how that changed and how it was used, because some people argued that nobody cared about the Revolution in the American past until after the Civil War, when it was used to help reconcile the nation. And I say that Valley Forge was actually a metaphor. It was cultural shorthand. So if people were using it as a metaphor, they had to know what it was, and it had to mean something to them. So I traced how the myths developed around Valley Forge and how that changed over the years. You kind of see some major shifts. So at the beginning, it's a place where ordinary soldiers connect to Washington. I was with Washington at Valley Forge. Not everybody can be next to him, at the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, but everybody could have had a conversation with Washington at some point during those 6 months. And then what you see is when they start offering pensions to Revolutionary War veterans, Valley Forge then really starts playing up the blood imagery, if you've ever heard about the bloody footprints in the snow, because it's this notion of blood sacrifice. I bled for this country, now you owe me something. I suffered for this country, you owe me something. And since it wasn't a battle, it gets reframed as a battle against the elements, a battle against the will. We suffered here and we made it through, and it's like a battle, in and of itself. And as the years go by and soldiers get older and older and then die, and then it's their children and their grandchildren, people kept saying, oh, my father was with Washington at Valley Forge. My grandfather was with Washington at Valley Forge. You'll see newspaper articles where a city says, we have the last Revolutionary War veteran who's lived at Valley Forge, in the whole state since, they just died. So it's this connection to the founding of the country. And then it gets tied into politics in the 1820s. And so both political sides are trying to argue who was more connected to the founders and George Washington. They would have been on our side. And they have these big rallies and events at Valley Forge to say, this is, we're claiming it, we're the right ones, this is what they would have wanted. And as they do these big political events, they give speeches about the sacred ground that we're standing on. And Daniel Webster, who was a famous orator of the day, they would write his speeches and they would publish them in the newspaper, or you could buy them as pamphlets. And so it would be like if Anderson Cooper or Sean Hannity gave, a live broadcast from Valley Forge and spent the first 5 minutes talking about how great it was and how it meant something. It shifts again in the sectional crisis and the Civil War, when both sides, the North and the South, are saying, this is Valley Forge, this is where the Patriots suffered. And the North is telling the South, how can you break this up? How can you betray what the founders created? And the South is saying, no, we're the real heirs of Valley Forge, and we're going to have another revolution to have a more pure version of what they wanted. And if we need to suffer to do it, we'll do it. And then Valley Forge becomes this darkest before the dawn metaphor. If we can get through this, we can get through anything. This was, this is our Valley Forge. But the problem is that since they knew it was bad, they knew that people suffered there. As they go through the Civil War, they're looking at through their own lens of experience. And the Civil War is way worse than anything that happened in the Revolutionary War. And so as bad as the Civil War gets, Valley Forge has to get ratcheted up in memory to be that much worse. Because one, it's kind of unpatriotic to say that you had it worse than the founders. Two, it was also a psychological thing. Well, if they made it through, I can make it through. And I even saw one article where they said that Andersonville didn't even compare to how bad Valley Forge was. And Andersonville was the worst of the worst in the Civil War, the Confederate prison camp. So then once the Civil War is over, it shifts again because they use the memory of the Revolution and Valley Forge to try to reconcile the nation. And so then it becomes the idea of soldiers' valor, that you were willing to suffer for a cause. Might have been the wrong cause, but you were willing to suffer like the Patriots did. And so you proved yourself to be their true heirs, and we're all brothers again, and let's come together. And so then I end my dissertation at the 100th anniversary. But you can still see it a little bit afterwards, even in World War I, when in 1917, when they put up the Memorial Arch in Valley Forge. At the speech there, they talk about the boys who were here in the encampments in the trenches. Well, they had earthenwork redoubts, which are, a little bit of a fortification. They weren't trenches, they were in World War I, but the people who were going through World War I, they heard trenches and that's what they thought. Wow. So the memory just keeps shifting based on what's going on in the country.
So give us some examples that we might know about of how the memory of like Valley Forge, George Washington, how did that shift over time that we would know about? Give us a few for instances.
So one of the most famous stories about Valley Forge is Washington praying in the snow.
Yeah. And the pictures that are
there's pictures,
everywhere.
It's been on stamps, there's famous paintings. Everybody kind of knows that image of Washington kneeling in the snow, hands clasped next to the horse. And that was actually published in a biography of Washington that came out after his death. The first version was in 1800, and that's Parson Weems. Who wrote this. The prayer story actually doesn't come out to a later edition until about 1805. And supposedly the man who owned the house that he rented at Valley Forge came around the corner and found him in a clearing, perfect setting, and he was down on his knees and he told the story. And, never happened.
Yeah.
Probably never happened. Washington's not going to pray in the middle of the forest. He wasn't going to pray the way that, Parson Weems said he did. And Parson Weems' book, which is also where the cherry tree story comes from, was written to almost deify Washington. It wasn't a real history, but it was also written as an instruction book. This is Washington, he's so great, you should act like him. Some of the stories in there are so that you emulate his behavior as much as anything else.
And don't tell a lie.
Don't tell a lie.
Yes.
And, pray for your country.
Yeah.
And so versions of the story keep changing the later that they get. And really, they were even published in the newspaper up until the Second World War. And so as the Civil War is coming, you actually see the story gets expanded upon where the angel shows him the Civil War. Supposedly now an angel comes down and then it has this big vision. And so the idea is that Washington couldn't be there for the Civil War. So he already prayed for it in advance.
And isn't there also a picture of that?
You'll see some etchings of that in the newspaper articles. It doesn't have a famous painting the same way.
For some reason, I remember something like in black and white, or black and like...
What you might see is the apotheosis of Washington. Okay. So that's when he died, and he's being carried off into heaven by angels. There's a lot of those that came out when he died in 1800.
Okay, so with that, let's fast forward to the Civil War. You said both sides kind of claimed the mantle on Valley Forge and the reality. So how did each of them use that story differently, right? Because they're opposing forces, obviously. You kind of got into a little bit, but how did each of them use that story as the means of kind of bolstering their particular vantage point, what they were doing on their perspective, or their end of the war?
They were both trying to say that they were the ones who knew what the founding fathers wanted when they created this country, and they were the ones who were right. And Abraham Lincoln actually said about the Civil War with the two different sides that they both served the same God, they both read the same Bible, and they had two different prayers, and they can't both be right. And it's very similar when it comes to the founding fathers. Both of them tried to connect to the founding fathers and say, no, we're right, you're wrong, our version of America is right, yours is wrong.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm taking all the questions. Fast forward into today's world. Where do you see, and again, not the story, but our version is the correct story of what's going on. How do you see people reaching back in the past and doing that right now? And maybe if you could be a little bit towards evangelicals, because I feel like we as evangelicals, we're very fearful of any kind of story that negates our understanding of the past. So how do you see it today?
So with people in the church a lot of the time, they're very patriotic and they want to connect to the founding fathers and, the vision of America about how this was a Christian nation and about how all the founding fathers were Christians. And you're like, yes and no. They were Christians, but they were more deist, which is kind of the watchmaker God. God created the universe, he wound it up, he sent it on its way, it has its own rules. He's not a relational God, he's not part of everyday events. Thomas Jefferson, there's the famous Jefferson Bible, where he actually cut out everything that was sort of supernatural or miraculous because he didn't believe that part happened. Yeah. So, and then there's the whole controversy over, the letter about, the separation of church and states and, what that really means. And so on the one hand, they want to connect to the founding fathers, but they kind of forget that they weren't necessarily evangelical in the way that we would say today.
Yeah, which I see it a lot from a church history standpoint, people connecting back to like, say, different figures kind of as you work your way, especially back into like World War II. The way that we all connect to, I'm just blanking his name. Who's the guy that died as a martyr? Bonhoeffer, my gosh. But I see that so often where they try to make him in the image of like a conservative, evangelical Christian, when in a lot of ways he was very much a liberal theologian in how he came at things. But we want to remake it almost to kind of give us a place to find energy and force to be able to like survive the world we live in.
Right, and like I said before, if you don't know the history and you don't know the context and you don't know what was going on then, all you're doing is you're looking at it through your lens. So you picture yourself there, you picture your friends there, you picture your worldview there. And so, everybody who's in church back then must have been like church is nowadays. Yeah. And they don't know, like I said, the context behind it. And one thing that I think is funny is the parable of the Good Samaritan. So nowadays, there's how many things named after Samaritans? There's Samaritan's Purse, Samaritan's Hospitals, all of that. Samaritan in our world is almost a synonym for a good person. Yeah. You had an Israelite show up here and said, oh, here's the hospital. It's named the Samaritan Hospital. They'd be horrified.
That's right. What?
So I guess the question I would have, and I know this is maybe like oversimplified, which is fine with me. Do you think that there are like historic facts? Are they neutral?
I mean,
I know that's a weird question, but are the things that happened in the past, are they actually neutral from where we sit now?
I mean, the facts are neutral. There was a George Washington, he was the commander-in-chief of the army, there was a Valley Forge, there was a Declaration of Independence. Once you start kind of understanding motives and stories and context behind it, then a lot of times things get a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, because I think that's a really important thing for people to wrestle through when we look at history, is that idea that there are facts, but then there's interpretation of those facts, and I think we often confuse those things. Right. I think that's where I think some of your work with memory, I'm trying to piece it all together here and going.
So there's different schools of history, like there's different, philosophies of anything. And there was a push for a while to try to standardize history and to make it scientific and to make it absolute and facts. And that's when you start seeing a lot of the statistics that you see, where historical, works are only charts and figures and pie graphs and all of that. And you're like, okay, well, yeah, that's true. How many plows did, each person own in the village? But, does that really tell us anything about history? And they were trying to boil it down to this scientific, there's no bias, but then it's not even really history in a lot of ways.
And it loses the story.
It loses the story.
I mean, that's the big thing, right? It's the stories that make history so compelling, to go back and understand, like you said, original sources, trying to understand who this person was. I mean, it kind of almost kills it as we constantly bring source criticism to bear upon it to kind of pick it apart. And then after a while, it's just this kind of sitting out there data. It's like you tore a rose apart and it's just mangled all over the place. Okay, so that is the way, obviously, that I think as we look at history, as you look at this time period in which we live in, right? And so you're somebody that spent a lot of time in and around different facets of history. So you, like you said, you love Egyptology, you love looking back at events in and around the Revolutionary War. Is there any other times you kind of really enjoy?
Yeah, Tudor history.
Oh yeah, you told me that, the Tudors.
Henry VIII is like the biggest soap opera ever.
Yeah.
Pretty much anything up till about the Civil War. Once you get after that, I'm not quite as interested.
You're bored with it.
Yeah. But no, I like ancient Greece and Rome, and I like Mesoamerica and the Aztecs and the Mayans. And I actually told all that to a professor in my first week of college who was an archaeologist. And I said, I want to be an archaeologist. What do I want to do? And he asked me what I was interested in. And I told him all these places, and he shut me down and he goes, you can't flit around the world. You have to pick one thing, because when you write your dissertation, and this is actually my first week of undergrad. It was a long time before I got to my dissertation. But that's one reason why I love working in museums, because just people bring me things from all over the world in all different time periods. Then I've got exhibits that come through, so I get to learn about all the different things.
Yeah. So as people are like looking to explore back into history, because I think this is a unique time. People are starting to read. I'm catching more biography. They're diving back in there. Maybe to understand how to think through history, what would you tell them? Like, so in other words, I've had to read for my PhD work, I've had to read book after book after book on how to like understand how we evaluate history, right? Where would you just tell somebody to start? If they wanted to go back and begin to understand history and they wanted to think rightly through it, they wanted to do the best they could, again, not getting into the awkward slicing and dicing it so it doesn't make sense, but also not using it, as this mythical, the way that we sometimes tend to mythologize history. How would you encourage they start? How do they start to get the correct lenses to look back on history?
I mean, there's so many people right now. Now is a weird time because we have so much information available to us, and people have really short attention spans. And so they're kind of overwhelmed by history or information or where to start, or it's just not a priority for them. And then you end up with people who just don't know anything about the past, so they don't understand why current events are happening necessarily. So I would say if you're kind of like, oh, well, why are people doing that? Maybe just start looking up the history of that particular thing. Pick a thing. You don't have to start at, the landing on Plymouth Rock or, and all the way up through now. Just pick something that intrigues you, that you've got questions about. Why did they do this? Why did they think this? Why did this article say, this thing? Why do they want to take this statue down? Who was that person? That's the nice thing about history, is it cultivates this just curiosity about the world and a way to sort of evaluate, think critically about what it is that you're taking in and what you're reading. So that would just be my biggest thing, is start with something that interests you.
Yeah.
I think if I can turn a corner and maybe move away from like modern US or even modern history and make a pivot to like biblical history, or like just like more, just biblical thinking, and saying, a lot of what you're saying is also true in like how we read the Bible, right? Of going, actually needing to understand the historical context of something, right?
Yes. So I always like to say that a lot of people have this idea that the Bible happened a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away called Bible Land. And they don't realize that it fits into history and world history. And when the Bible talks about Egypt, it means Egypt. Like the pyramids and the pharaohs and all of the actual place.
That wasn't Bible Land.
It wasn't Bible Land.
I know, but Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, didn't they come up with Bible Land? I didn't realize everything took place.
So yes, there's real places, there's real events. It talks about real kings and kingdoms and pharaohs and events and battles. And then that's also where my other background comes in of archaeology, because archaeology sort of can help fill in the gaps of what's not written in history. And so these people they were real people, and they do exist outside of the Bible. So obviously we want to get more of the truth from the Bible, what God says about it, but to know that these people were real people and they left real things behind. And, it's all anchored in this world.
Yeah.
I think that it really does matter for people when they realize,
that
it's what you just said of going, it's not like this hyper spiritualized thing of going, oh no, I would even add not just the archaeology and the history, but also the geography of the land. Like there's actually real places, like, oh, this mountain range is real, and it actually dictates how travel happens, or whatever it is, right? And going, but knowing those things actually help us this will sound weird, but knowing history actually helps us know God better, because we
Yes.
can understand his word better.
Yes, because there's so many things in the Bible when people say, oh, do you take the Bible literally? It's like, well, you take it literally when it's literal, and poetic when it's poetic, and metaphorical when it's metaphorical. But if you don't understand the culture, you might not understand the metaphors, you might not understand the references. And then it just gives you that deeper understanding of what's going on once you go, oh, that's what they mean. That's what they talk about. Why did they throw a shoe at him? I don't get it, you know.
Yeah. No, you can go.
Oh, I thought you had a follow-up.
No, I do. I have all kinds of questions
I was
about
loving
this, but no,
this
it's
discussion.
okay.
So in framing these different things, because this is really where, again, I obviously I have a love of history like you have a love of history. It's why I've spent so much of my time thinking it through. The problem that we oftentimes run into is right now I feel like we're so historically illiterate. There's almost this just vacuum out there in which we don't know how to bring history to bear on it, right? So I mean, even a good friend of mine, we were starting to talk about the idea of if reading the Bible, and he's like, why do I need to understand all these different things, right? Well, it's almost like, well, you will never truly understand what these writers were writing until you understand the historical context of what they're looking at. So for a Christian, okay, and this is me throwing you a softball here, so I'm going to throw it out there. How important is history to understanding Scripture? From your perspective, like how important is history?
I think it's very important. And obviously, I'm not saying you have to get a PhD and you have to read all the footnotes. But you need to have, like you said, a general idea of where it happened in the world, what countries, are involved. They changed names a bunch of times, but it's the same places. Like I said, trying to understand cultural references, but like I said, at the very least, understanding that these are real places, there was real history. You can point to that mountain, you can point to that country, you can point to that temple. And there's places where people walked that are still there. And that's what I talked a little bit about earlier about personal memory, is why do people want to go to Israel? Because they want to walk where Jesus walked. They want to walk where these people walked. They want to see these sites with their own two eyes. I mean, it used to be you had to take a pilgrimage there in order to see it. Now I can pull it up on my phone and look through a bunch of pictures. But that doesn't mean I don't want to go see it because I don't want to make it mine.
Yeah, no, I think just piggybacking off of that, it is fascinating to see it normalizes and humanizes the biblical
that's what I was
story.
getting to.
I'm going, it's fascinating going, once people start to both understand the history, the geography, the kind of this, the first century world, and even before that, or even, kind of the Old Testament time period, it normalizes it. Now all of a sudden reading the Bible isn't this like hyper spiritualized thing. It's like, oh, the reason David picked up 5 stones is because they were in a creek bed and there were 5 stones, and it's like, and he had a sling, like that's normal, right? Or going, the reason they're talking about tying a millstone around someone's neck is because they grew a lot of grain and had a lot of millstones, and it's not like this hyper spiritualized thing. And I just remember a guy talking to us and saying, oh, this just made the Bible accessible to me.
Yeah.
And it was because he actually understood a little bit more of the history, geography. And so I would say it actually isn't just necessary, but it actually helps us understand and love God better.
It humanizes.
Totally humanizes.
Right.
And so I'm going to plug museums again. So museums are great for that because there's so many, exhibits, whether they're traveling or whatever, where you can see the things. When it talks about, where clay pots that were broken, you can see what a clay pot back then looked like. I went and I saw the Cyrus seal at the Getty Villa a couple years ago. So when it talks about King Cyrus and about how he let the Israelites go back after the Babylonian captivity, like there's the seal from the guy who gave the order. Right. And, when you know about the past, when it talks about, so Joseph, when he was in charge of that Egypt with the pyramids and the Sphinx and all of that, that there was a period where they had to mourn, his father and where they prepared the body. Well, that was probably mummification. When Joseph said, take my bones with me to, the promised land, when you go, he was probably mummified. There's probably an Egyptian sarcophagus somewhere out there. And it's just even little things that people don't even really know. There's so many obscure kings and events in the Bible that archaeologists are just starting to find. Like, who knew who King Sennacherib of Assyria was, And the more that you can actually see these physical items, the more the world of the Bible becomes real to you and you can picture it. And so right now, people are sort of living in their heads and they're trying to imagine what it looked like. And if you don't know what things look like or smelled like or the terrain or anything, it's hard to imagine. But if you can actually start to see some of these real physical everyday objects, it can help connect.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Like one of the ways I've tried to get my kids involved in history is to let them see things, touch things, hear story. I mean, over and over, I think story is such a phenomenal way because we can't always go touch things and see things.
Right.
But we have access to so much story right now to help people begin to fall in love with history in so many different ways. And especially then helping people, especially for Christians, by falling in love with history, we actually begin to fall in love with the intent of the text, right? It's meant to be a historical in the nature of it. And I think sometimes we see it more as like a moral book or a book that kind of gives us some quick information, or we'll even say things like, it's God's love letter to us, which again, I'm not discounting all of that. But it is a history. It's telling us an actual story of events from beginning to end. And I think actually Christians should have a massive love of history because that's how we connect to our entire narrative of who we are as followers of Jesus.
And when you know about history and you know about events, you can see God's hand and how he shapes them. And the part of the problem is that we're reading the Bible so far removed and not realizing that these things were kind of happening in real time for these people. And so when you read about prophecy, we know some of them that have happened, some we don't know yet, but it's like when there's the statue and it's the bronze and the silver and the gold, it's like, oh, well, now we know that's Alexander the Great and it's this and it all fits. They didn't know that.
Yeah.
And so to know that Alexander the Great came, his empire got split up into 4 pieces, everything exactly like they prophesied, hundreds or thousands of years beforehand. And then you can see how God is shaping these major events in history.
Yeah.
But if you didn't know that there's an Alexander the Great that comes later, then you wouldn't know that prophecy is fulfilled.
Yeah.
But I think you guys just turned a corner in this conversation, which I love, by the way, of going, it's moving the conversation away from just history being kind of this thing to study, and now all of a sudden you just anchored it, and both of you in your own ways, you anchored it into, well, this is really the story of what God has been doing in the world, and it's kind of God's redemptive plan. And you certainly see that from Genesis to Revelation. But you go, okay, as much as we can talk through the history of the Bible, which it is, I mean, the Bible is a historic book, and there's certainly other things that are going on in there, but it is a history of God's redemptive plan. But that redemptive plan didn't stop at when the Bible, when John penned the last words of Revelation. The story of God continued on. And that's where I love the work you're doing in church history and going, but the redemptive plan of God continues on, and we are now a continuation of what God's redemptive work is. Yeah. So even setting ourselves into that context of the story.
Well, we are in history.
Yeah.
Right, no, exactly. That's but it's not just a history, it's God's, as believers, we are part of God's redemptive plan in bringing all things, making all things right.
Yeah. All of the orchestration that you're talking about, right, of what God is doing, I think sometimes we can lose sight of the fact that we were orchestrated into that reality. The way that God has moved and shaped history, and even in the events that, the thing I love about history, right, how often do we read of these terrible, awful events, but how it absolutely took history in a direction that is, amazing, or if this wouldn't have happened, this wouldn't have happened. But yet to see ourselves in that history now, I think, and again, this is for me how looking at history, it allows me to understand as God's shaping history to trust him actually more, right? And his capacity and ability to work things where they need to go is phenomenal.
Yeah, so when, the Bible says what the devil meant for evil, I'm going to use for good, that's true of us and of our lives, but it's also true of countries, it's also true of the entire world.
Yeah. Systems and, right, everything.
But as I'm processing through this, it's tying it all the way back to where we started with what you did your dissertation on. I'm going, we so often want to whitewash the ugly parts of whether it's personal history, whether it's collective history, whether it's the church body we're a part of going, we want to make the bad not maybe seem as bad as it was. and maybe we want to whitewash things and just kind of make it look a little better. Maybe put a little lipstick on it here and there, and go, and I don't know that if we remember that we're a part of God's redemptive story, it probably gives us the capacity maybe to be a little bit more maybe candid on certain things.
Well, to your point earlier, right, it helps me when I rewrite history to have this almost mythical tone to it. I don't relate to it anymore because I don't live in a mythical context
where everything is good.
And so like where I'm doing my work on is back into the Reformation. Well, everybody looks back at the Reformation as this, massively glorious, wonderful time. And we then tend to look at it and go, oh, look what the Catholics did to the Protestants, right? But in actuality, all of them were sorting through history and trying to figure out, and the things that Luther did, you're like, whoa, Luther, what were you thinking? And Calvin
wasn't a saint.
And Zwingli, right? I mean, the guy I'm writing on, he's a Protestant. He's getting attacked from all sides by the Protestants, the Catholics. And what we do when we whitewash that is we, in a weird way, we dehumanize them. We no longer see them as people sorting through life like we do. And they're imperfect, and they make poor choices, and they make good choices. And that's why for me, that's why I think I love looking back at history and being honest, is it allows me to even go, okay, I'm in this thing.
So in the play 1776, they actually have that conversation at the end, and it's fictional, but where they said, no, they're going to know we're just ordinary guys who did the best that we could. We're not these, half God figures. But there's also another line in there, which I think is funny, where John Adams is complaining that he's not getting any respect. So he says, history is only going to remember that it was Ben Franklin, George Washington, and the horse that won the whole war. And it's based on a real letter, so the sentiment is right. They made it quippier. But he was afraid that he was going to be written out of the history, so that Washington would be lionized, Franklin would be lionized, and nobody else would be remembered. Ugh. And so as we start whitewashing portions of history, there's obviously, denialism of huge chunks of history, but even when we start to whitewash just to make things look a little bit better, it has this ripple effect downstream. So, it's like pictured, now I'm getting into geometry, an angle. So it's, we're only about this far apart from the truth, but the longer you go, the farther away you get. And then you've got these just gaps of memory, of understanding here, because, the butterfly effect, you started with this one little thing, I'm just gonna make this look a little bit better, and 2 or 3 generations down the road, that whole thing has been forgotten or changed, and it just completely changes the story.
So do you think how do we help people? I guess, and this is just like practical, like when you see that happen, and you see maybe people's recollection or current understanding of past events being skewed by that slight altering and whitewashing and trying to make something look a little bit better than it was. But then 2 generations later, now it's believed. How do we help them go back to a more accurate understanding? So, do you think that's even possible? Because now you're actually, you're taking someone's, you know what I mean? I'm going, can you even help people maybe help me?
It's not easy. In some cases, you need to go back to an older source, a primary source, which not everybody wants to do. They just want their 30-second video on Facebook and move on. So if you're getting kind of, this seems a little bit too good to be true, is that really what happened? Is that really the story? This narrative is a little too neat, then maybe you should do a little bit more checking. But other times, sometimes it needs to wait till something comes to a head and there's a crisis, there's a clash, there's something for somebody to go, wait a second, how did we get here? What's going on? Let me go back to the beginning and figure out how we got here. Yeah.
So what do you do with this kind of a statement? And you can interpret this, take some liberty with it, that history was written by the dominant culture, or history was written by people who won the wars, or history was
conquerors.
What's that? Yeah, history was written by the conquerors, or it's even the recollection of the event is by the ones who.
So once again, it's true and it's not completely true. So obviously, yes, whoever's in control is kind of writing the narrative, but unless you're in a completely totalitarian society, and even then not totally, there's all these other memories, and they're coming from the bottom up. And so you'll see historians where they're very cynical, and that's what they say is, the government is, or the elites or whatever is putting out this, story, and that's what everybody believes, and they're trying to trick people, and they might be putting out that story, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what everybody really believed or everybody knew, because all these individuals and all these subgroups kind of have their own memories. And like I said, it's just this, this conglomeration of all these different stories happening all at the same time. And you have these weird Venn diagrams where like, it's overlapping. Like I remember this part, but not this part. And you remember this part, but not that part. And so it's never as simple as that. And there is, commemorations, there is anniversaries, there is events. Every time there's, an anniversary, a national holiday, something like that. Yes, they are sort of putting out, this is the story. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only one. And it might not be the right one. So we're having the 4th of July coming up, and everybody's excited about that. But John Adams, once again, would be very surprised that we're not celebrating on the 2nd of July. And that's a statement I like to put out on Facebook every couple of years, where he says, everybody will remember July 2nd, and we should have parades and fireworks and everything, because that was the day that they approved the resolution. It's not the day that they signed it. The Declaration of Independence, which wasn't completely signed until August anyway. And so, even the story that he thought was going to happen isn't the story that happened.
Right.
So, Spencer, let me just throw this at you, because I've always appreciated you think through some of these aspects of this. We're sitting in our place in history. Here we are. This is our time where we exist. And I think sometimes it's always hard to evaluate your place in history. Like, where am I right now? How do I think through it? Could you speak to that just a little bit and kind of help us wrestle with that kind of?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, I love that we're having this conversation, Jen. I appreciate the way God has gifted your mind. It's super cool to hear the faithfulness that you've demonstrated and just putting time and energy into thinking through this. But to get to your question, I think that I hope that we actually understand that the study of history isn't just an academic pursuit. It's not just a quest for more information or more knowledge, or even a way to actually interpret and help us make sense of the world going on around us. It is all of those things.
But it's more.
But man, I hope that we all realize this, that history is always set in the context of what God is doing in his redemptive plan. And that every one of these historic events has always been a part of what God is doing in the world. And so, that started way back, Genesis 1 and what God intended for his creation. Yeah. Sin screws that up, and then God promises this amazing redemptive story. It doesn't stop at the end of the Bible. It continues on through history. And that's where I go, even now when we actually get the opportunity to walk through museums and walk through significant sites in history and read documents, it should always point us to what is this telling us about what God is doing in the world, and how can we interpret this in light of King Jesus? Mm-hmm. And not everything in history is going to be good and beautiful. Sometimes what history shows is the brokenness of humanity, and the very thing that we get is, man, this world is broken and it's marred by sin, but man, look, God has always had this faithful remnant that's actually putting him on display faithfully. And if we can get through the content of history and actually see what God is doing, man, that is where this stuff comes alive in a way that actually then lands and goes, oh, so for me right now in 2020, in the midst of a pandemic, watch this. This isn't the first pandemic that happened globally. This isn't the first time there's been racial disruption globally. This isn't the first time we've realized there's oppression in the world. Yeah. No, these are things that have happened previously. Here's how the church has entered into that. And look, we can learn from that, and we can learn what to do, what not to do, but we get to see how God has been advancing his redemptive plan, and we get to join him in that. And I go, man, don't stop at just learning stuff. See how the gospel can go through it. Yeah. Sorry, I'm starting to preach at you, but then this is where I get land this sucker, because this stuff is important.
Yeah, it is a fascinating reality that the way that we use and evaluate history that too often is devoid of looking at it through a biblical lens, right? We don't mean Amen. To, but we have this tendency to look at it because it is, like for me, I think even if I wasn't a follower of Jesus, I'd still be intrigued by history and I want to understand it, and we'd be having debates. Is it linear? Is it circular? Is it, all these different things in which we evaluate history, but it is God's history, right? It is him working out his plan.
It is his story.
Yeah, and as we work that into our evaluation of it, I think it brings people to life, right? It causes you to have those no way moments, right? That you just sit there speechless going, my goodness, how did God orchestrate all these events? And I think now in our time, which I've been trying to do as we work through Romans and even as we get into the book of, in the letter of Philippians, is that this is the time in history God has placed us, right? I mean, who would have, I was thinking about it one day, who would have ever thought that the three of us, like why in the world are the three of us even sitting here right now having this conversation, but yet in God's grace and mercy, right? He chooses to put us in this time, in this place that it'll never happen ever again, but yet for his grand purpose and what he's seeking to accomplish in the world, which to me, that's what causes my mind to go and be blown away by it. But yeah, I think we're meant to be not just enamored with history, but to be blown away. There should be a sense of awe and wonder at how God is orchestrating events.
Well, there's nothing that's happened historically that's inconsistent with biblical truth.
100%.
Even the atrocities of history are 100% consistent with what the Bible says. Mm-hmm. Humanity is broken and perverted and bent, and that we don't function, we don't exercise authority the way God has called us to. So we see horrible abuses. And so history shows us the way the world truly is, but it's consistent with the biblical narrative. And then you also get these beautiful glimpses of redemption in history, and you go, oh, but that also points to, it's like there's just nothing that is inconsistent with the biblical text.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean everything is like hey, that these are Christian movements, but it just means everything is consistent with what Scripture says.
And we need to be honest with that.
Yes.
Right? When you look back at slavery, I was thinking through this today, which we always talk about it, is that they were Christians that obviously were engaged in slavery in such a way that you look back and you go, oh gosh, right? Your heart just sinks when you think about people that claim to be followers of Jesus. But then there's this other side of it where these people shine in the midst of such darkness, the way God uses them in the midst of an event like that. But we need to see both of those things. We can't whitewash it. We can't pretend one existed and the other didn't. That is the reality of history, right? It tells the story of what was going on in history at that point.
And there's different ways to read the Bible. Obviously, there's sometimes you're going to be a little bit more scholarly and you're going to go verse by verse by verse. But how many people have really sat down and read through an entire book all at once or multiple books? And when you do that and you read it like a story, then different things stand out at you. Because I was doing that and I was going through some of the Old Testament. It was like, what do you mean they're doing that again? They did it 2 chapters ago.
What are you thinking?
They screwed up again? They just did. And you see them over and over and over and over again. And you wouldn't catch that if you were going through a book, a verse a day over the course of, 6 months.
Yeah.
So it gives you, once you read it as a story, as a history, it gives you different insights.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. We good? Yeah, that was great. All right. Let me just finish it up. Thank you all. I just want to say that for joining us for this discussion. I hope it encouraged you. I hope, like what Jen said, and I think it's like I always tell people this, find someplace. Like dive in, enjoy, go learn stories and find out what it was that framed and shaped and molded this reality that you're looking to explore. Enjoy it, but I think to bring in just this other side of it also of what Spencer brought to bear, look at it through this lens of redemption, this amazing work of God of what he's doing in this world. Don't forget in all of this kind of wrestling it through to evaluate it kind of in those, I think, frameworks. Enjoy it, but man, look at it through those lens of how God has called us to look at things. So thank you. Thanks to the two of you. I'll say the same thing for Spencer. Every time I talk to you, I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to pick your brain a little bit more. But seriously, thank you so much just for joining us. If you happen to see her around, you can ask her all kinds of other questions about this. But have a great day, a great evening. I'm not sure when you're going to be watching this. Love and appreciate you all. And we miss you. We'll see you.